was developed only around 1940. Our love for the Southern Plantation Society, revered for 5 generations, it was a society that itself lasted for only 1 generation. Jim Wayne Miller noted yesterday that we create tradition. We also have a habit of clinging to the idea of a tradition long after it's gone. When the pioneers came in here, they followed paths of least resistance along the streams, and succeeding generations kept to those paths. Routes that had been necessary to pioneers became habits for their grandchildren. That's why today we still have a habit of building our highways in eastern Kentucky along the flat lands. Not just habit, but it's more expensive in this part of the world to build up along the ridges. Peer pressure, habit, and convenience, and not deep independent thinking, set the pattern for religion in the mountains, not just in Appalachia, everywhere. Look at the wide number of Germanic names that you find in these mountains. One would have expected to find Catholic, Lutheran, and maybe even Quaker settlements here. But the people who came had lost those traditions long before they arrived, and most had been absorbed into the Baptist, Methodist, and non-denominational majorities of Appalachia. Simply stated, those who flock together become birds of a feather. That's my position. Peer pressure rather than devotion dictates that the Middle East is Muslim, that the West is Christian, that Rome is Catholic. For the past century, information has been available to independent thinkers, but most choose to follow a path set for them by their neighbors or families. Most of them follow independent, individual paths to religion, with allegiance to God but to no church. And in this territory, I think that would be around 4 people out of 5. As an example, when Mattie Lyons Large of Louisa, age 79, married Delbert Shorty Sprouse, age 18, back in the late 1940s, she was typical of the non-attached believer. A newspaper of that day wrote, "Although she is not a member of any church, she lifts up her eyes to heaven and declares her faith in God, denounces sin in any form, and backs up her declarations with favorite quotations from the Holy Bible." Even when adults go through life with a strong particular creed, they often change for lay reasons. Youth programs, music, even geographic convenience. Obituaries from the past declare a man's allegiance to a particular sect, but note that he always attended another church after his legs got out from under him and he couldn't climb the hill anymore. Now, Ben Moore was a leading immigrant from Magoffin County who became a federal judge in Charleston. He became a leader in the church he adopted after he married, and in a book he wrote, he very frankly stated a position that many others keep quietly to themselves. "I have never really understood my own relationship to the church. I served as assistant superintendent of the Sunday school of the Baptist Temple at Charleston, West Virginia, with 2,000 members for several years. The entire membership, I am sure, regarded me as one of the most orthodox and thoroughly organized of Baptists. Despite all this, I have always known in my heart that I took little stock in organized Christianity." Politics is much the same way, and I cite the mechanics of change as representative of what can happen in other fields. When I was growing up, Carter, Clay, and Johnson counties, among others, were solidly Republican and had been since the Civil War, when it became fashionable and profitable to wave the bloody shirt. Floyd, Elliott, and Morgan counties were always Democratic, following a Confederate bent. Now, a reasonable and rational trend is today making all Kentucky counties universally Democratic. That's a stretch of the imagination, but I have to say that to prove my point. Here's how it works. A Republican in Elliott County next door here to Round, there are 44 of them, 44 Republicans, has no voice in local or state elections. He has no old boy connection with or claim to Frankfort. Common sense overrides the principle of independent thinking. If he ever wants a job or wants to influence such partisan decisions as road gravel, he registers Democratic. Won't be fooled. He still votes Republican in all the national and state races, but nobody knows he's doing that. That secret vote means that his registration makes no difference until the next generation. Son comes along and follows the family pattern. Dad was a Democrat, so I'll be a Democrat too. The difference is that son is a born Democrat. And in 80% of votes where he has no personal favorite, he votes Democratic because that's how he's registered. And that's what his dad was, or so he believes. The transformation is complete. As the fluid population comes and goes, it develops lands and cities, places. When those places no longer provide sustenance, they are abandoned as a part of natural change. They become ghost towns or ghost farms. Ghost towns like Peach Orchard and Black Star and some of the other coal camps that you've spoken about. My own home county of Carter next door has undergone several of these changes. First, it was the salt industry replaced by refrigeration. Next, the iron furnaces faded with the coming of steel. Then timber went. When locomotives stopped burning coal, the fire brick industry fell. Now, coal mine employment is being cut back because of mechanization, and the tobacco market is falling to foreign imports. Still, the population and unemployment remain high. Those who left sought opportunity. Those who cling to place either have a job, don't want one, or have given up all hope. Their staying is caused by some other opportunity or vision of opportunity. We've spoken of attachments to place. No, I skipped. It says here, turn the page quickly. I turned it too quickly. As a supporter of the law of supply and demand, I do not believe there are good reasons for subsidizing economies of territory. Recognize that resources and markets are in flux and let the population flow. Change is occurring more rapidly today, and those changes may create new ghost towns in our area. In Greenup County, for instance, the explosive manufacturers moved out at Wortland. The railroads are closing down at Raceland, leaving only residential communities. Ashland's traditional steel industry has been standing in jeopardy. As the population fluxes, other towns grow up. How many of you here ever heard of the town of Flatwoods? Oh, that's pretty good. It's a bedroom community in Greenup County, and I haven't checked figures lately, but the last time I looked, it has a larger population than Pikeville or Prestonsburg or Paintsville and maybe even Hazard. If you never heard of it, it's because there's nothing there except people. Eastern Kentucky, coal, oil, and steel are subject to influence from home and abroad from those same forces that worked on this country as far back as 1810. That's when people in Floyd County, and Floyd County in those days took in all of this territory through here too. Floyd County had a dandy market for bear skins. They sold them to Europeans who made shakos for soldiers. But the bears moved west and uniform styles changed, and there ended a popular market. Coal, oil, and steel may suffer in the same way. Earlier this morning, Gary Cox mentioned a situation that he had found, and I reflect much the same situation, a person who had never been more than 10 miles from his own home. I remember a lady who lived next door to me who said she had, and this was 35 years ago, who had never been outside of the county. And I can relate to that very, very closely because my own grandfather, who died this year at the age of 101, was a man who always wanted to sleep in his own bed at night. And he might get as far away from Mount Sterling as Huntington, but he would come back every night. Missed very few nights. Also this summer, I dealt in writing a story. A Martin County couple, very rural, from probably up in a cove, brought a son to Ashland to the hospital to have a fish hook taken out of his eyeball. And they had to leave the son there. But the mother expressed far more concern about getting home before dark than she did about her son's eyeball. I have spoken a lot about attachments. The people I'm talking about are people who move away and expatriates, out-migrants. And I want to focus on some research that I've done lately that deals with a single county and the attitudes of the migrants from that place, the diaspora. As you may have noted, Magoffin County has a homecoming every year. And they've had 8 years, and on Labor Day weekend, they crowd in there, though you wouldn't believe it, but it's a 1 or 2 day situation. And there's reason to believe that McGoffin Countyans may have more of this of place than anybody in the world. A study that was part of a UK thesis in 1950 included this sentence: a study of persons from McGoffin County who had been absent from that county during World War II showed strong attachment to home, even though they freely expressed the feeling that other places were better to live in. Going back 25 years beyond that, Governor Edwin P. Morrow, making a speech on Kentucky Homecoming Day in McGoffin County, said it this way: "McGoffin, your children have come back to you. In other lands beneath other skies, beyond broad rivers and towering mountains, they have made heavens of their homes, paradises around their firesides. And yet, from uttermost ends of the earth, thy children have come back to you." Judd Arnett, a cousin of Alvin you mentioned a moment ago, was taken. He's a Detroit Free Press columnist. Now, Judd, I think, really spanned. His father was born in Salyersville during the Civil War, and Judd is still writing a column for the Detroit Free Press. He described in 1971 the phenomenon for thousands of McGoffinites who live in his Michigan neighborhood. "Although I was taken screaming and kicking out of Kentucky at a tender age, the pull of the dark hills remains irresistible. About once a year the homing instinct starts bubbling and yammering, and I must return for one more look. Then I am a stranger among strangers, family excepted, but peace flows back into my immortal soul, or somewhere." Now, how do the learned doctors explain this? After a serious flood hit Salyersville in 1939, R.C. Patrick, a native of McGoffin living in Mississippi, appealed to Senator Pat Harrison for sympathy. "Now, you may say that flood's nothing, Pat, because a great many places have floods." "Yes, but Pat, this is my hometown. While I have not been there for 34 years, it still bothers me." More often, reality has dictated action, and in this case, Frank Rice wrote in 1913 from Elgin, Oklahoma, to his mother, still in McGoffin: "With all the years I have been away from home, I think of my mother and never forget her birthday. 76 years is quite a long life, but I hope you will live to celebrate a great many more birthdays. I am sorry I cannot be with you today and talk of the long ago. I would like to come home for a visit, but I do not think I would like to live there again. All would be so strange to me there, and the way of doing business would be so different I would have to learn all over again, so I do not think I will ever come home again, only on a visit." Frank Rice was a realist. He expresses the true feeling of expatriate mountaineers both for yesterday and today. "In some misty dream world, we believe we are attached by an umbilical to spots on earth, but practicality and reality know better." One of my college recollections came from fighting a fire at the Richmond Stockyard in 1954. A Mexican woman, we called out a Mama, I never knew her real name, plunged into the barn and pulled out the horses to safety. But the horses kept running back inside because they thought that was where safety would be. A second generation of horses raised outside those barns would no longer feel that way. In that same token, second-generation Appalachians no longer have their corpses sent back here for burial. They were born into a flat land and never picked up their father's habits of setting the emergency brake on an automobile. They don't need to. Jesse Stewart wrote a short story called "This Farm for Sale," and in it he told of a man who had it with his hillside farm. He'd lived there all his life, and he couldn't raise enough to make it. So he went to a friend like Roger Lewis, a realtor, and asked him to sell it for him. And the realtor went to the home with him, and they stood and they looked at it, and the man said, "There it is." They spoke very little, but the realtor looked and stood around and watched a while, and he went back to his car and he stayed there, and he wrote up an ad, and he brought it back to the house to show it to the man. And he said, he described the house in there. He told of the beautiful lake down below, the hillside green, the soft pastures and the trees. And the man read the ad, and he said, I want you to tear that up. He said, I've just decided this is the place I've been looking for all my life. We have created these dreams, created that ad for ourselves, for Appalachia. Thank you. I was a little concerned when I prepared this paper for fear that I was going to be out of step with the general theme, which is a sense of place in Appalachia, which is a kind of a sacred symbol in itself. That is, sense of place in Appalachia, in quotes, is a sacred symbol. And what I really was intending to do, or I should say felt welling up within me, was the tendency to debunk the symbol. Now, what I have to say is not really so much based on data as it based on personal experience. So I thought I probably should make an apology in advance before I get into the meat of what I want to say and explain how I came to see or experience things the way I do. It's not that I haven't collected lots of data in southern Appalachia. I have. I've got file boxes full of data I've collected in this area, particularly in West Virginia and eastern Tennessee and western North Carolina, a little bit in eastern Kentucky. But when I was collecting that data, I wasn't studying southern Appalachians. I was studying people. And I never really thought to differentiate southern Appalachians from other kinds of people. I felt that by and large, when you scratched the skin, you got the same kind of blood, and underneath they probably functioned with some variation fairly much the same way as other people did. On the other hand, I've lived in Appalachia or spent time in Appalachia all my life, and much of what I have to say, I think, is based on my personal experience as seen by somebody who's warped by a lifetime spent as a psychologist. Psychologists have peculiar views, you know. We do read minds. We sometimes keep it a secret, we do. And so I thought I ought to explain what my own peculiar point of view is so you could make allowances for my personal biases. I was born the son of a coal miner in the middle, absolute middle of southern Appalachia in Dowell County, West Virginia. My earliest memories are of hanging over a front porch watching men haul coal out of a coal mouth that was not over 100 feet from the front door of our house. To me, I still feel, I don't smell it very often, but coal smoke still gives me a kind of a homesick, nostalgic feeling. I love the smell of coal smoke. I don't know too many people who do. I can't, the last time I smelled it was 2 years ago in China, where they still run coal engines. That might be a place for some homesick Appalachians to go to recapture some scenes from their past, because I think of some I saw in backcountry China that reminded me of backcountry West Virginia. My family then moved to Pittsburgh, and we maintained our contact with West Virginia. I was one of those children that people traveled back and forth to home to visit, and I spent my summers in West Virginia. And I can remember traveling back home on a regular basis, as many speakers have pointed out, on the weekends. I always had a sense of that being where home was, rather than Pennsylvania. After I became a psychologist, I spent the first 10 years of my professional career in East Tennessee. I was at the University of Tennessee, and I worked with a traveling mental health team that traveled throughout eastern Tennessee, southeastern Kentucky, and western Virginia. I did psychotherapy and personality assessment with many people from back up in the hills or back up in the coves and the hollows. I served as a substitute preacher for little churches back in the country in East Tennessee and southeastern Kentucky and West Virginia. And I even ran for public office and have campaigned back up in the hollows and the coves, asking people for votes.
Back up there, you wouldn't get a vote if people didn't. If you didn't personally ask somebody for a vote, they wouldn't give it to you because they figured you didn't want it because you haven't asked them for it. So that's where my observations come from. I think much more from personal experience than from any kind of data that I have collected. And the essence of what I'm going to say is the idea of home is a symbol. It's not a place. It's an illusion. It's something we carry around in our heads. It isn't some spot in a map. It's not a geographical location. I remember perhaps 30 years ago seeing a man stand up in a little white church in West Virginia, a little town in West Virginia, and say that I feel closer to heaven here than any place on earth. This man was a professor at Columbia University. He was to become the editor of the Journal of History of Ideas. He was a distinguished scholar. During the war, he had joined the Marines as a private, and he'd worked his way up to lieutenant colonel. So he'd been around the world and he'd seen quite a bit. Furthermore, he didn't live in West Virginia. He lived in New York, and he moved to California, where he's now living when he's retired. He hasn't moved back to West Virginia. He's one of those exiles or expatriates or immigrants, one of the people of the diaspora. Now, what was it that made this little place in West Virginia, what was it that gave it such proximity to heaven? It was the fact that this was the place that this man grew up. It was home. Home carries with it certain feelings, certain thoughts that nothing else carries with it. I have a quote here in the paper from Flynn, who wrote, "Approaching home produces eye misting and throat tightening." Because the fact of the matter is, home is a part of our identity. It's a part of a sense of who we are. Now, one of the experiments I've conducted, including conducting it in Southern Appalachia, is the experiment of asking people, who are you? I'd ask a class of students or a group of people, just write down on a piece of paper, who you are. And I've collected hundreds of these. I continue to collect them up there in Indiana from time to time when I think about it, but I get the same answer so often that I don't bother nearly as much as I used to. But basically, when we meet somebody, we try to figure out who they are by first of all fixing them in space. Where are you from? In time, how old are you? Or we look at them and we guess how old they are. We may not ask them right out. But, you know, we look at things like, when did you graduate from school? And things like that. Have you noticed how we do that? And if you look at a newspaper story, if you were to walk out across the street here and get hit by a truck, what would tomorrow's newspaper say? It would be, say, Tom Jones, if you're a student at Morehead, 21-year-old student at Morehead State. It always fixes you in time, in age, which fixes you in time. And space, where do you come from? And in the social structure. If you're in a small enough place in Appalachia, it's what's your name? What family do you come from? And if you come from one of these small communities, you'll find people there who can tell about your family going back 3 and 4 generations. And it doesn't matter what you are, you're still fixed by the family that belong to. But if we get out into the wider world, we may ask people, what is it you do for a living? Which also fixes you in the social structure. So place is a part of our identity. Another part, and returning home or the sense of home, is really an integral part of our identity. I can remember as a kid, after I was out wandering in the world, thinking to myself, I know who I am and where I came from, and I don't intend to deny it or reject it. One of the speakers talked about sense of place becomes important when we have a sense of being different or alienated from the group we're from. Now, we have quite a group of expatriate West Virginians at Purdue University, and we know who each other are. And there's a sense of community or camaraderie or kinship amongst us in that setting. Whereas if you moved us back to where we came from, that sense of kinship would probably disappear, One part of the sense of place is a sense of where we came from. A second part of sense of place is a desire to regain a lost past, sort of a nostalgia for our own childhood. Garrison Keillor, in his book Lake Woebegone Days, describes the old Norwegian immigrants in Minnesota. Look at the religion, there really wasn't all that much difference, and so they tended to exaggerate what small differences there were and make a big thing out of them. But the truth of the matter is everybody had pretty much the same religion. Today we're exposed to television. Today we have interstate, and so we can travel around. Today, as a matter of fact, where the Church of Christ used to sit in that little town, there is now a Catholic church. Can you imagine that? What desecration. You can find people there in town who still cluck about this, and how could such a thing possibly have happened? But from Peter Berger's point of view, and although he's not a Catholic, he teaches at Boston College, from his point of view, the important thing that happens here isn't that foreign ideas come in, or that in seeing television or traveling around you see that there are different places and different ways to live, or that there are different occupations. The important thing that happens is we become aware of the fact that there's more than one way to do it. Now we have to make a choice. My great-grandmother really didn't have much choice. He moved over a little bit, a few miles, picked up a farm from where he had grown up, and he started a farm. And he went to the same church, or had the same religion as his parents had had. My children, on the other hand, don't have the choice, or let me put it another way, do not, without exception, just automatically assume they're going into my occupation. It so happens I have a son who is, but he went through a period of trying to figure out what it was he wanted to do, and in fact there was a period of time when he decided he wanted to do something else, not because he didn't like it, but because I was in it and he figured he was supposed to do something else. Is that clear? You follow what I'm saying? He didn't want to be a psychologist, not because he loved psychology. He didn't want to do it because his dad was doing it. He figured he ought to do something different. And then later on he figured, well, what the heck? Sure, my father can't have ruined it entirely. And so he decided to do it. But he had to go through a process of choice. That's my point, choice. That is to say, modernity comes about because we're faced with choice. We have to choose where to live. We have to choose what we're going to do for an occupation. We have to choose what we're going to believe. Because we get exposed to a wide variety of different values and beliefs. And this is what Berger said modernity is. Now the point is that modernity introduces a certain homelessness into our existence. We don't have any accepted fixed points. We have to nail down the tent pegs for ourselves. Nobody else has nailed them down for us. Nobody else has sunk foundations for us. If there is no accepted truth with a capital T, then what is truth? And how is your truth any better than anybody else's truth? And if it's no better than anybody else's truth, which is different from your truth, how can it be truth with a capital T? We've all become existentialists in the Kierkegaardian sense. You know, Kierkegaard, who said, the truth that edifies is the truth for... But the point I wanted to make here was the introduction of modern life with choices has produced a certain amount of psychic and spiritual homelessness. We've lost our fixed points. Now, C.A. Iliad, in his book The Sacred and the Profane, argues, and in fact I know as a psychologist that this is true, man cannot live in chaos. If you work in psychotherapy with somebody, One reason you're working with them is whatever conception they've had of the world isn't working. They're anxious, they're depressed, life isn't going right, and part of the reason going right is because the way they think about it doesn't fit the way it is. It's not working. It's as though you had a map for life, and as if you had a map for town, and it says turn right and you'll find the post office. You turn right and go down one block and there's no post office there. There's just there's a drugstore or an empty lot, fire station. The map's wrong. And so you figure, well, there's something wrong with this map. I better get me another map at the wrong town, or this map's old and out of date or something. Well, it's the same way in psychotherapy. And when in psychotherapy they come to the point where they realize that my conception of who I am and what life is and where I fit into it no longer fits, there then comes a period of really deep fear and almost terror, because now they're in a mapped world. They're in a kind of a chaos. Human beings can't endure that very long. You have to start structuring it. And Iliad makes the point that sacred space organizes the chaos of the space that we live in. In this book, he cites, for example, the navel of the earth as being located on the Temple Rock in Jerusalem. I happen to have looked at a map recently that in fact has the navel of the earth located on it, but it's not on the Temple Rock. It's right in the middle of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, located between Calvary, where Jesus was crucified, and the tomb in which from which he was resurrected. But at any rate, whether the navel's at the Temple Rock or between Calvary and the tomb, there is a navel. There is a sacred place on earth. And certainly the Temple Rock is one of the most sacred places on earth. The Temple Rock is supposed to be the place where Abraham was to sacrifice Isaac. It was the place where the Holy of Holies was located in the temples of both Solomon and Herod the Great. And it's the place from which Muhammad is supposed to have ascended into heaven. And of course today it's located under the mosque, the dome of the temple. But it's become a holy place by virtue of the fact that this is where events from God, or where God has touched the earth. And it is a place, therefore, that is a very sacred place to a large number of people, to both Jews and Muslims, as well as Christians. A certain place also becomes sanctity because of the fact that that's where a lost past was lived. This is the place where something very important happened. Eudora Welty, for example, writes about her mother never getting over the loss of her home in West Virginia. She moved to Mississippi. A Norwegian writer, Bjørg Vik, in a story called Slechter's Gong, which translated into English would probably be Kinfolk's Time or Kinfolk's Way, talks about a Norwegian carpenter who had to move into the city because there was no work in the village that he was living in. And essentially the story is about mourning his loss of place, the familiar sights, the familiar mountains, the familiar people, the familiar roads, and the loss of the significance of his skills. He lived in a place where everybody knew who he was and what family he belonged to, and now he lived in the city and nobody knew or cared. Moving from one place to another produces mourning, and there's been an increased amount of psychological research on the study of loss. The most obvious losses are losses of people. People die and you lose people. There may be loss of roles when people retire or when they're fired from a job, when a business closes down or an industry closes down, and they lose their job, they lose their position, they lose therefore their meaning, and they mourn this loss. There's also loss of place. Loss of place means loss of familiar sights, familiar landmarks, but it also means loss of familiar relationships, people that you knew. And people go through a process of mourning. Adolescents go through a process of mourning when they leave home. Adolescents want to leave home because this is a sign of I'm grown up, I'm on my own. But at the same time, when they do that, they're alone. I can remember when I was in the Navy, standing on the top of I was hitchhiking from San Francisco to Reno, Nevada in November, and I was standing at an intersection somewhere in Sacramento, California, with my thumb out trying to catch a ride and thinking there wasn't a soul in the whole world who knew where I was. And I wondered if anybody cared if they had known. That, I think, is something that every adolescent goes through at some time. And you go through a process of mourning the home that you have lost, the security that you've lost. We think in terms of moving on to the next step in life. An adolescent moves on to the independence in life, but independence carries with it the possibility of failure. It means moving on beyond being supported by somebody else. And this then carries with it both fear and a mourning. And home is a nostalgia for that which we have lost, that security that we've lost. Finally, another part of the illusion of place is a sense of home in the future. It's a sense of the ultimate future. Earlier, Larry McGee, he talked about life in this world as a trek of tragedy, a pilgrimage. That exact quote, I wrote it down because it struck me as it fits in here. I got out a songbook. I know it's a songbook that's been used in the churches in Appalachia because I've seen it in lots of churches in Appalachia. And I can remember singing songs in little churches in Appalachia, and I got an old copy, about 30 years old, with the shaped notes and so forth, and looked up certain songs. Now let's take, for example, the hymn "There Is Habitation." The 2 lines from it. "O Zion, Zion, I long thy gates to see. O Zion, Zion, when shall I dwell in thee?" And I'd sing it, but my wife won't let me. Another one is "Marching to Zion." You know the song? We're marching upward to Zion, Zion, the wonderful city of God, the beautiful city of God. "The hill of Zion yields 1,000 sacred sweets before we reach the heavenly fields, before we reach the heavenly fields. Or walk the golden streets, or walk the golden streets. We're marching to Zion, beautiful, beautiful Zion. We're moving upward to Zion, the beautiful city of God." Now this is a part of the religion of Appalachia, and it talks about a place that we're going to. I've got some hymns that I'm going to read here later, that talk in terms of home. But it's a sense of place as a place that we're going to. Now, what is this Zion that's being sung about? I mean, what's the big deal about Zion? Well, actually, the term Zion is based on a literal place. It's Mount Zion, which is located now in Jerusalem. And it's not all that great a place, actually, if you look at it today. It was the site of the original city of Jerusalem. It was first mentioned in the Bible when Abraham, after he'd defeated the kings, he came to give a tithe to Melchizedek, who was the priest and the priest and the king of Salem. It was the place where David put the Ark of the Covenant after he captured the city from the Jebusites. It's the place where David is buried. It's the place where Jesus is supposed to have had the Last Supper with his disciples, and it's supposed to have been the place where the Holy Spirit descended on the gathered disciples on the day of Pentecost. In other words, Mount Zion, although it's a very unremarkable looking place today, it's got a church on it, but other than that, you wouldn't. I can think of places in Indiana and Kentucky that are, I think, even more impressive looking than, and in Tennessee that are more impressive looking than it is. But it is a sacred place because it's a place where God repeatedly touched the earth in order to carry out some divine purpose. And it became a symbol of longing to the Jews in the diaspora that occurred after the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. So much so that when the movement for the Jews to return to Israel came about, it was called Zionism. The import of Mount Zion is not in what it is today. Rather, it is in what it has come to symbolize, what it means. It's the illusion. It's what people carry around in their heads. It's not what's literally there. And for the Jews, it was an example of a recapture of the losses of the past. And I think in the hymns of southern Appalachia, it's also a longing for a recapture of what's lost in the past, what has been lost from the past. This is expressed in other popular hymns. In O Land of Rest, for example, asks, "When shall I lay my armor by and dwell in peace at home?" Wayfaring stranger says, "I'm going there to see my mother. She said she'd meet me when I come. I'm only going over Jordan. I'm only going over home." Or "Lead me gently home," says, "Lead me gently home, Father, lead me gently home, Father, lest I fall by the wayside, lead me gently home." And my favorite, Beulah Land, which is an old southern hymn. I remember correctly, it plays in the background of the movie on Sergeant York. So I look away across the sea where mansions are prepared for me and view the shining glory shore, my heaven, my home forevermore. And will the circle be unbroken, which was, I think, sung by the Carter family. Will the circle be unbroken by and by, and a better home awaiting in the sky, in the sky? And then there was one, I think, in the background of the movie last night, Long Journey Home. It says, "We shall all be united in that land beyond the sky." That is, their sense of home as a symbol of that which we hope for in the future. And talking about heaven is talking about home and talking about being reunited with people. And I think with senses of feelings that were associated, or that we wished were associated with, had been associated with that place and that time and those people. It's a symbol of the future which gives meaning to present life. It infuses meaning into present life. Our mental pictures of our own homes are just as illusory as the picture of Mount Zion. The Jews have, of course, returned to Mount Zion, and they returned to Jerusalem. You know, they used to say next year in Jerusalem. Well, they're in Jerusalem now. And what a mess. Jerusalem is, as Teddy Kollek, the mayor of Jerusalem, has said, it's not a melting pot, it's a mosaic. And people said, well, when are you going to solve the problems, of which the place has innumerable, what seem to be insuperable problems? He says, well, we'll probably solve them before New York City did, which I thought was a good response, implying that it wasn't the only place with problems. But if you think the people who've returned to Jerusalem are now living in bliss, go there and you'll see they're not. They got traffic problems, they got ethnic conflict problems. Well, you can read in the newspapers, you know what kinds of problems they got. Our feelings of home are just as illusory, and I think that the feelings of yearning for that which we've lost, a lost home, are just as illusory as the feelings that go with falling in love. Now, to those of you who are younger, this may come as a shock, but falling in love is in fact an illusion. As Theodore Reich put it, we fall in love, well, as I put it, based on my own study, people are most likely to fall in love when they're in the process of transition in life, when they're dissatisfied with themselves, and the reality of the relationship then displaces the illusion. And presumably, if they weren't too far off in their illusion, they form what some people call a companionate relationship or a friendship. That is, they form a mature love that is based on reality rather than on illusion. Now, if you know the hymns, the country and western music, and I've studied country and western music, about 3/4 of the country and western music, which incidentally came out of southern Appalachia, I don't know how it is now, but it used to be in East Tennessee. You could go up any hollow and find some group that was picking and singing. About 3/4 of those songs are about lost love. somebody done somebody wrong songs. And there's an infinite variety of those songs. But the fact of the matter is, what people are mourning when they break up, and sometimes, for example, this may have been a man. She'd be talking about this man who ran off and left her. And she's mourning this man, and if you talk, I'm talking now about clinical work. I'm not necessarily talking about songs, although it's in songs too. But you're talking in clinical work about this man who used to get drunk on Friday and Saturday nights and come home and beat her up. Loretta Lynn has a song, Don't Come Home, Don't Come Home a drink with lovin' on your mind? Yeah, which expresses it pretty well. He goes off and she's full of grief. Now what in the world are you full of grief for? The man didn't bring his paycheck home. You couldn't counter support you. He got drunk every weekend and he beat you up. What is it exactly that you're mourning the loss of? Why aren't you glad to get rid of the no-good bum? There are people who've gotten rich writing books about this. Well, the fact of the matter is, what people are mourning is not the loss of the literal lousy relationship. What they're mourning the loss of is the illusion they had that they had projected onto this person. That which they hoped it would become, in spite of the fact that there wasn't much evidence to support the idea it was going to. It's the illusion it's the loss of the illusion that upsets us and distresses us. And it's the same thing about home place. The illusion is that the home place is a permanent place, sort of the seat of the family. Well, the truth of the matter is, the home place has not been a permanent place in Appalachia. James Agee, who was born and grew up in East Tennessee, in his book A Death in the Family, writes about a visit of the small 6-year-old boy to his father's home in La Follette. They lived on Clinch Avenue in Knoxville. And they went up to visit his father's home in La Follette. And while they were there, they went out into the country to visit great-great-grandmother, who lived so far out in the country that you had to go back up dirt roads and beds to get there. And in fact, nobody in the family had been there in quite a while, so they had a little trouble finding their way in there. This was written about an event that occurred in 1910. This grandmother had been born in 1811 or 1812. So she would have been the children of the original settlers. The first settlers came into this area in the late 18th and early 19th century. But the reason I'm citing it is because each generation had lived in a different place. Now, if we go on to James Agee himself, he ended up in New York. There's a small hop, and then a bigger hop, and then a bigger hop. When I undertook the project of writing this paper, I went around and asked Appalachian exiles at Purdue where their home place was. And they all knew where it was. They could all tell me where it was. But as it turned out, none of them had grown up there, and none of them were living there. It was usually the place where their parents or their grandparents had grown up. And as a matter of fact, in my own family, I know where the old home place is. It hasn't been in the family for 55 years. It's not where I grew up. It's not where my mother grew up. She was born there, but she didn't grow up there. It's where my grandfather grew up and where my mother was born. But it was not my great-grandfather's home place, which was located some miles away, probably 8 or 10 miles away, in a still different place. Home is the place, as somebody has said, and I've got a quote in here, I've got 2 or 3 quotes, that basically home is the place where you were born and grew up. That's home. But if you look at the home places, and I've noticed in people talk here at this symposium, the same thing is reflected. If you look at what the home place is, the home place for one person in a family is not the same as the home place for another person in a family. And I traced back my own family for over 200 years. 15 years or so I got curious about this thing, started tracing it back, and they've really meandered all over the place. That is to say, the fact of the matter is, the idea of a home place is an idea or a symbol. It's not a literal place. I suspect if you were to trace back your own home places, you'd find that they moved around too. That what you think of as home place is probably where your parents or your grandparents grew up. And if you went back farther, you'd find that they had moved from someplace else. Now, there's nothing new about this. This is old in the history of Appalachia. Sims, writing back in 1842, says that all the forester needs to hear is that there's deeper forests and sweeter waters someplace else, and he's ready to pull up his stakes and move on. The fact of the matter is, people moved into these hills they followed a well-known path. They came into Pennsylvania, and then they moved on into western Pennsylvania and down into West Virginia, or they went down through the Shenandoah Valley, into the valley of Tennessee, through the Cumberland Gap, up into Kentucky, and across Kentucky into Indiana and Illinois, or they moved from western North Carolina up into the mountains. Now, the mountains are very high down there, so you didn't have anywhere near the amount of movement that you had down through the Shenandoah Valley and the valley of the Tennessee and then up. That's where the flow was. And you can find, I know quite a few people in Indiana right now who can trace members of their family who were dropped off along the trek down into Kentucky and Tennessee and up into Virginia, all the way up to Pennsylvania. These people kept moving, and this migration has continued into this century. George Wolford talked about the diaspora from Appalachia, and I think that's a very good term. It's interesting to me that we're using the same symbols, lots of different people, and we have any communication with each other, but we're using the same symbols. Back in the 1920s, 25% of the population of southern Appalachia immigrated. You got that? 25% in the 1920s. In the 1940s, it was 22% from eastern Kentucky. In the 1940s, it was 22% from eastern Kentucky. In the 1950s, it was 32% from eastern Kentucky. In the 1960s, it was 6%. In other words, there's been a high rate of immigration out of this area historically for as back as you can trace it. I've counted up the people in my own family who are adults and independent that I can recollect where they are, and of those 6 people, I'm not counting the younger kids. I haven't kept track of them, the grandchildren. I've got cousins who've got grandchildren that are on their own. I haven't kept track of them, but of the 60 people I could count up, there are only 3 still living in southern Appalachia. And in fact, the area in which I live is full of people who've moved there from West Virginia, Kentucky, and Tennessee. Now, this emigration is partly economic, that's true, but I don't think it's entirely economic. I also think that there is a kind of a restlessness built into people. I told you I'd traced back my own family for over 200 years, and I didn't find any generation that was living in exactly the same place where they'd grown up. They continued to move. I'll grant you that the movement may not have been much more than over the mountain to the next hollow, but nonetheless they kept moving. And I have noted here in the paper, I don't think that Davy Crockett and Daniel Boone were motivated primarily by a desire to make more money. They were curious to see what was on the other side of the mountain. In fact, there's a song about that I remember from my childhood. Why did the bear go over the mountain? Do you remember that one? To see the other side of the mountain. And then there's always another mountain, and you go over that, and soon you come to flatlands, and then you wonder what that leads on to. On the other hand, and I guess I better hurry up here, there are reasons why people have stayed in the mountains. When I was a psychologist in Tennessee, I was struck by how terrified some of those people were to come into the city. And how happy they were to get out of town and back into the hills again. In fact, several sources I've cited here have noted how people talked about the hills as shield people from the world. I have a colleague who was from Laurel County, Kentucky, who conducted research over almost 20 years in the 30s and 40s in eastern Kentucky, and he observed the IQs of the students declined as he measured them from year to year. That is, as each subsequent cohort of students came into school, they had lower IQs than the cohort before them, and as students in a school progressed through the school, the average IQ of the classes declined. The reason was there was steady out-migration of the people with the higher intelligence quotients. It was the people who were the stable who tended to stay, which suggests that some of the holding on to the land is really protecting them, is an attempt to protect yourself against being exposed to the demands of the world. Studies of attachment and loss suggest that people who get especially attached to place are people who have not been successful in establishing successful attachments to people in childhood. And this is particularly a problem where you have very large families. And it's very difficult then for the children to form an attachment to a nurturing parent. Thomas Wolfe made the same observation when he said that he talked about a family, that North Carolina family, in which one group had moved to the city and one had town and one had stayed in the country. And he said that those that stayed in the country remained the same, but he said they weren't the same. They sang the same songs, but they should have written new and better ones for themselves. They spoke the same tongue, but they should have developed a new one for themselves. The lives their forebears lived were harsh and new, still seeking and explorative. Their own lives often just squalid, which should have been better. And he's saying the same thing, that oftentimes the people who stayed were simply, that what happened was the life there deteriorated. And it was a function of an inability to face and cope with the real world outside. The fact of the matter is, there's no way we can hang on to home. Judith Viorst has written a very popular book published last year about necessary losses, in which she writes, in the course of our life we leave our left and let go of much that we love. Losing is the price we pay for living. It is also the source of much of our growth and gain. The truth of the matter is, as you get older, you're bound to lose home. I have written here a couple of poems written by Elise McClay, writing about losses that come with old age. They say old people change, and in a way that's right, because change usually means our being worse off. Less money, a furnished room instead of a house. And in a poem about a man who tried to commit suicide because somebody had stolen his hat, she writes a poem pointing out why he would try to do that. It was just the last straw for him, was the point. And she says, every time you turn around, time, with a little help from your friends, grabs off something else, something precious, at least to you. Hearing, sight, beauty, job, house, even the corner grocery store turns into a parking lot and is lost. This life is a process of steady loss, is the point. There's no way we can avoid losing home. We're going to lose it sooner or later. I guess it came home to me the strongest 3-4 years ago. I was on sabbatical and I spent it in Norway at the University of Bergen. And when I came back home, it took me more than a year. In fact, I'm not sure I've adjusted to it yet. It was as though I had not returned home. Home had left me when I'd gone. And the main reason was the last of our children had left. They had meanwhile finished college and left. And so when I came back, there had been other changes. People I'd known had retired, had died. But it was as though I was coming to a totally new place. It was the same house, the same university, the same office. But the whole environment had changed on me. It was as though home had fled while I was looking the other way. Well, I think this is inevitable. One way or another, we're bound to lose it. And here's where I get to the theme that Larry McGee earlier this morning talked about. Life in this world is a trek of tragedy, a pilgrimage. Basically, man is ultimately homeless on this. Jesus said, foxes have holes and birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. The song Wayfaring Stranger says, I am a poor wayfaring stranger while traveling through this world of woe. There's no sickness, toil, or danger in that bright world to which I go. The idea of life as a journey, as a pilgrimage, is expressed repeatedly in various ways in the religious thought of the region, and I'm very happy that a formal expert on the religion of the region, Larry McGee, earlier this morning said precisely that. It's the idea that life is a pilgrimage. There's a line from a poem I can remember singing as a child, and I haven't been able to find it anyplace, and if any of you know where it is, I wish you'd tell me. The line is, "This world's a wilderness of woe. This world is not my home." But I can remember singing it in small churches in West Virginia. Malcolm Muggeridge, although he's not a Southern Appalachian, he's an Englishman, wrote that the ultimate disaster that can befall us is to feel ourselves at home here on earth. Now, this I want to read, I guess. Having argued that the old home place is an illusion which does not and cannot exist in reality, I must now confess that hanging on the walls of my family room are pictures of the birthplaces of my grandparents. Hanging on my dining room wall are the pictures of my Mount Preacher great-grandfather and great-grandmother. In my living room sits my grandmother's secretary. In the bookcase sits my grandfather's set of the Harvard Classics, which he gave me as a wedding present 168 years ago. I regularly revisit the place where my family came from. I look through old albums. I go see Coal Miner's Daughter every once in a while just for the pure nostalgia of it. And I loved that film last night because it reminded me of scenes of my childhood. In fact, I would swear there's a picture of Mother in it. Does this touch us the way it does? I think our home place is sacred to us because of the same reason that Zion is sacred. Zion might not look like much today, but it's the place where God repeatedly reached down and touched the affairs of men. In the last analysis, the work of God on this earth is the act of creation. Our home place is sacred to us because it is the place where God reached down, touched the earth, and created us. Our special place in this earth is not geographic. It's an idea and a feeling about our own creation. And the place in which it happened is sacred because it is connected with this happening. It is the place of our deepest connection with God in the past and the promise of the recovery of lost connections in the future. Thank you.
I'm going to deal primarily with music as it relates to home, a sense of place. I'm interested, I suppose, more than anything in the aesthetic and the culture of the ordinary people. I've been helped a great deal with this with several friends of mine, Wayne Miller, who was here yesterday, Charles Wolf of Middle Tennessee State University, who's written a great deal about mountain music, Tennessee, Kentucky music, and Bill Malone, the author of Country Music USA, who teaches at Tulane and teaches primarily Southern cultural history. This summer, Bill C. Malone was at Berea, and he was playing lots of early Appalachian music and country music, and one of the teachers in the workshop said, how about playing Eddie Arnold? She said, I don't like the singers who sing through the noses. And Bill drew his, 200 pounds up and looked at her and said, does that make you better than those who do? And she shriveled a bit. The point is that some of the music I'm going to play, some of the things I'm going to talk about, is probably not the music of everyone. And people tend to see everything through their egocentric eyes, through their own cultural formations, baggage, and thus we like one thing and we can't understand why other people like something else. But the music of the Appalachian Mountains is certainly distinctive. It is not distinctive to Appalachia. The music that has made up what we now call country music certainly came from music that was typical of Appalachia, and many of the people who were the early perpetrators of this music were from the region, or certainly from people influenced by the people of this region. Bill C. Malone said that the culture, the people of the Ozarks and Oklahoma and Texas represent a sort of a dispersal westward of the Appalachian people. And I believe Robin McNeil and his co-writers in the recent public television series on the English language and and the book, of course, the story of the English language, have somewhat suggested that Appalachian speech and perhaps the Appalachian aesthetic has greatly influenced country music and great parts of the cultural history of this country. So I take all of this seriously. There are some singers that I don't particularly care for, some music that I don't necessarily listen to when I'm home alone or traveling in my car, but I'm interested in its reflection of the lives of the people. And it seems to me that this is a worthy thing. Now, music is one of those things that I believe that scholars of Appalachia have had a little bit of trouble with. Last evening we had one of the finest fiddlers from this part of the country, Bailey, fiddling, and of course the White House Band here. And some of you were there and some of you weren't. But anyhow, I think you missed something good there. At the Appalachian Studies conferences, we have treated music as something peripheral, something to entertain us a bit after we have listened to the important stuff, the papers. And the musicians have to be referred to in announcements that they will be in such and such a room after dinner if you wish to go down and listen. And almost never have they been introduced as important persons in perhaps reflecting a bit of Appalachian culture. Scholars can deal very well with sociological things, perhaps with the literature of the region, lots of other things, have a little more trouble across the board in dealing with what we think of as Appalachian music. I want to deal today with music reflecting that definite sense of place. I can agree with President Stevenson, who spoke last night, that somehow there isn't that sense of place if you're thinking about Appalachia. And one way I can prove that, I think, is that some of my students from Appalachia are still misspelling the word, or using the adjectival form or the noun form when they should be using the other one by the midterm exam. I think it's because that is a foreign word to them. It hasn't been one of the things they've thought about or talked very much about in growing up. And I think what John Stevenson was referring to is the fact that we may relate to a place, a town, near Asheville or near Hazard or whatever, however we designate the place we come from. It may be the county, it may be the mountains. We like to say we're, he said, just no hillbilly, or we're mountaineers, or we're West Virginia or Kentucky, or maybe even eastern Kentucky. And there is this sense of place, though, I think, and I've been fascinated by folk music in general from the Alps, for example, where people sing nostalgically of home in the mountains and somehow the scenery they remember from that. The old ballads, modern country, whatever you listen to, does have some reference to the sense of place. Many of the old ballads have been localized. Knoxville Girl, as many of you know, about a murder supposedly in Knoxville, is really a reworking of the old Wexford broadside ballad from around 1700 or something. And you have ballads, you know, like the cruel ship's carpenter, where they will talk about the banks of Tennessee rather than the banks of Italy. People tend to localize things, and then they sing about it and get some sense of place from somehow localizing. And I have an example of that in a minute. I selected 3 themes for this presentation with bits of music to illustrate them, and these relate to sense of place. The first one is that desire to ramble and see the world. The second is nostalgia for the old home place, cabins with lights in the windows, silver-haired daddies and mothers rocking alone in the old rocking chair. And then 3, that yearning for heaven as the final home where loved ones will be together with Jesus. Appalachian people have been presented by writers as homebound, as insular, isolated people who know little of the world outside their hollows. In reality, many of us have been ramblers. The history, in fact, of our people is a story of movement, of migration. We are a restless breed of people. We left England, Wales, and Germany early on to settle in Pennsylvania because of what was happening back in the old countries. We left Scotland for Ulster and then joined others along the East Coast. All were not content there even, but moved generation by generation through the valleys of Pennsylvania and Virginia until they inhabited the Appalachian region. But many settled down there and are still there, but others continue to roam from ever westward. We went for wars or jobs or just to see the sights. Even the earliest settlers roamed incredible distances, like the Indians who preceded them, sometimes being gone for months or years. Harry Carter was telling me about a fellow from down near Barberville who ran a store, and somebody came by one morning and said, "Let's go hunting," and he came back about 2 years later. And we heard about a husband who went out to get something before supper time and never did come back. His faithful wife had fixed supper and waited. And 2 years later, he walked in and sat down at the kitchen table for his supper. People tended to wander. There were lots of those. I had an old uncle who said he saw every state in the West except Utah, I think. Just going to see it, see what life was like out there. Or in his case, he said he left to keep from killing a man. Had a little with somebody, and he thought it'd be better just to leave. Well, anyhow, even they roamed and were gone, didn't think anything. Daniel Boone himself was the quintessential wanderer who would come to Kentucky, or did, and stay perhaps a couple of years. Died in Missouri. He represented a lot of people like that who settled in perhaps Virginia. He came out of Pennsylvania, settled in North Carolina, was fascinated by Kentucky, and later went on to Missouri, and there were lots of people who did that. In more recent times, the Civil War, the Spanish-American War, World Wars I and II, Korea and Vietnam, and now the Middle East, have taken our young men and women to the far corners of this country, even of the world. The factories of Ohio, Indiana, Michigan, and Illinois drew literally millions of people for jobs, and most of them are still there. We heard references this morning, Dr. McGehee, to Harriet Arnow's, the doll maker. Jane Fonda decided to make that a prettier picture and had her getting ready to come back home, and of course they'd all like to come back home, but the fact is that most of those 3 or 4 million who left over about decades are not going to be coming home, except perhaps to be buried, or perhaps better to retire. A few of them will. But anyhow, many adjusted there. Many of them dreamed of home. I have a few snippets of songs here to suggest this wandering notion. And the first one is The Storms Are on the Ocean, the Carter Family. This is a variant of a song or songs having to do with wandering but promising to come home again, usually telling one's lover that no matter how far I go, I'll come back again. And this song is related to that old Scottish ballad, The Lass of Rockroyal, which asks, who's going to shoe your pretty little foot, and all of that, you know, while I'm gone. This, though, is the Carter Family version of that.
I'm going away for a while.
This next one is a comment that you'll need to listen carefully to. Jake Gabbard, I heard about him as a singer. He was in the Old Masons home in Shelbyville, Kentucky. He was 92 years old when I went to see him. Later on, I taught his great grandson. I know two great-granddaughters. One is working for Gerald Roberts over there, and his great-great-granddaughter worked for me last summer. Very colorful man, had been a deputy sheriff over in Jackson County, but he tells here, and I need to give you a little introduction to this, I think. He's singing a bit of the Rake and Rambling Boy, but he talks about making this song after his adventures of wandering around, and he sat down up in Columbus, Ohio, and made this song. And you frequently heard this where someone took a song that was traditional. Maybe they knew it was traditional, maybe it was just something in their heads that they recalled and wrote down and changed a little bit to make it their song. And Mr. Gabbard has done here. Just after him, I think it goes right into it, is Doc Watson singing from an old Baptist song, Where Is Now My Father's Family, talking about dispersal of people going elsewhere.
This is George Gabbard at the Mason's home. I'm 92 years old. I was born and raised in Jackson County, McKee, Kentucky. At the age of 21, I decided I wanted to run and back. And I rambled through all the big cities and through 17 states. And I finally wound up in Columbus, Ohio. And there I decided to quit and made me a song about the rambling boy. And if you want to hear it, I'll sing it for you. I want what is but a rambling boy. In the middle city that I have been, in Columbus City, out the highway, I spend my money at a ball I play. Some have lost and I'm so distant. I'm a little
This next one is the Rebel Soldier, I guess you call it. This is the Blue Sky Boys, and this traditional song, it's a variant, I guess, of Jack of Diamonds, which we've all heard, I think. But this is a story about a rebel soldier rambling. To North Carolina, boys. Those who went away from home, of course, yearn for home. Southerners in general, and mountain people in particular, have many songs about home. In looking for songs, we have a large folk archive and lots of tapes and so forth. I really didn't have to go into that. I took a stack of records like this and just read down through the songs that were on them, and there were plenty of songs, and more than I could use, about home, something about home. Sometimes they reflect nostalgia or just the terrain or the old home place or friends of yore. Usually they're about a childhood cabin. I don't know how many cabin songs there are. The politicians seem to love cabins as a place to be born. But in terms of nostalgia, if you're going to write a song about you do it about my old cabin home, or my cabin in Caroline, or the little old log cabin in the lane. I'll have a little of that in a minute. About the cabin, or about mother in a rocking chair, or fathers whose hairs have turned to silver. It's the end of his quote. That song, as you all know, last night I went to sleep in Detroit City and dreamed about the cotton fields at home. I dreamed about my mother, dear old papa, sister, and brother, and I dreamed about the girl who's been waiting for so long. I want to go home. I want to go home. Oh, how I want to go home. Now, here are a few other songs illustrating the yearning for home and family, and I'm going to do another one by the Blue Sky Boys, which is the original version by Ada R. Abershon and Charles H. Gabriel of Will the Circle Be Unbroken. One you may have heard is the one about mother and the funeral. That's Carter Family, isn't it, the version about the death of mother and the hearse come rolling to carry her away. But this one is really about family, when family was together, and about the longing for being together again. The second one is a song called Long, Long Ago by the Addams Family Quartet. This was issued on a record, it's just the same today, the Barnacle recordings from the Tennessee Folklore Society. The Addams Family Quartet is not the smoothest quartet you ever heard, but I think it was typical of the singing at the time that this was recorded. This song was written by Frank Musgrove. I mentioned the little old log cabin in the lane, which was written by William Shakespeare Hayes, who was the steamboat editor of the Louisville Courier-Journal and who wrote many, many popular songs. In fact, there's one thesis written on by a young woman from Berea, but she has dealt with him entirely as a popular songwriter, seemingly unaware that some of his songs became country music favorites. And the little old log cabin in the lane, which was probably written about a black gentleman who has nothing left but his old cabin and his dog. So he hasn't gone anywhere, but since we were talking about cabins, I had to put a little of this. And this is Pop Stoneman, Ernest Stoneman, and the Blue Ridge Corn Shuckers. And they were a very important group of singers, the Stoneman family. You see his daughter Ronnie on Hee-Haw. I'll be referring to Hee-Haw a little later. The next song is In the Hills of Old Kentucky by Bradley Kincaid. We were talking yesterday about Carl Davis's Kentucky. Kentucky, you are the dearest place this side of heaven to me. There are lots of songs about Kentucky and many of these other states. They're Kentuckians certainly had a strong feeling for the place they came from. Bradley Kincaid came from Garrett County, Kentucky, went to high school at Berea, went to Chicago to attend the YMCA college, was singing with the Glee Club down at WLS, and somebody said he knows the old Kentucky ballads, and he was invited to appear on the barn dance and became really the most popular radio star of his day, singing over several radio stations. And this is a later recording on Bluebonnet Records done when he was about 60, long past his career, but his voice has remained very good. It's a little lower here than it was on those old 78s he made earlier. Bradley, by the way, last week was out driving at the age of 92 and was broadsided by a woman and is in the hospital there in Springfield, Ohio, but he's doing quite well. He's a very tough and resourceful person and one of the finest Kentucky gentlemen I have met.
In the hills of old Kentucky, where the birds sing merrily, and the southern breeze is blowing through the trees, that's where I long to be, where the mountain trail is winding, where the sweet wild flowers grow, in the hills of old Kentucky, to my mountain road.
Mike Klein was over here noting his guitar run there. This was long past the time when Bradley was practicing, and Bradley sung recently at Berea, and he sold his guitar, this Martin that he had, it was worth a fortune, and one day when his son was out, they ran a music store, he sold it to somebody. I know where it is, but it'll cost you $5,000. So Bradley takes...
Just to find out where it is.
Yeah, well, no, I'll tell you where it is. It's in Durham, North Carolina. But anyhow, he will just take an old Yamaha off the rack, you know, and arrive and play. So his guitar is a little bit rusty there. The next one is I Have No Mother Now, and this is by Suzanne Edmondson and Carol Elizabeth Reynolds, who sing for Mike up at the Augusta Festival. This was a song that made somewhat popular by Lily Mae Ledford and the Coon Creek Girls much earlier. After these girls sang at your festival this year, someone called me from Florida. He was so moved by this song that he had to have the Lily Mae Ledford record so he could hear it and also learn the words. Well, Carol Elizabeth is my daughter, so this is the reason you are now hearing them sing this song rather than Lily Mae Ledford, which I ordinarily would have done. She's a good friend of mine, too. Place and mother were always tied up together in most of these songs. The next one is Homecoming Time in Happy Valley, and this is Scott Wiseman who wrote the song and performs it here. Scott Wiseman and Lula Bell, his wife, sang, I guess, for more than 30 years on the National Barn Dance, WLS in Chicago. Scott's dead now, but Lula Bell is still very much with us, but she's very reluctant to sing anymore. She's actually wonderful as a singer. This replaced Happy Valley.
Homecoming time in Happy Valley. All the folks I used to know are gathering in the grove. The church bells will chime in Happy Valley, calling home the good old friends I love.
Scott wrote the song, Have I Told You Lately That I Love You, which is one of the most popular country songs. It was also a popular song. This next pair is one of the best trios I think that ever sang. Hazel Dickens and Alice Gerard. Hazel Dickens has, I just think, the best country voice in the business, and few people know about her outside the folk circle. They're singing a song called Green Rolling Hills of West Virginia, and that was a song written by Bruce Phillips. Auto Harp. Got two bluegrass numbers for you. The first one, Bill Monroe, Why Did You Wonder? This was written by Lester Flatt and Bill Monroe when Lester Flatt was part of the Bluegrass Boys. Second one is the Blue Ridge Cabin Home, Lester Flatt and Earl Scruggs. Singing, written by Louise Certain and Gladys Stacy. The bluegrass sound you will recognize. We won't talk about it. It's a read up version here. I was trying to think of some stories about music. There are not a whole lot of good funny stories, but one of my favorite ones was something Frank Prophet said many years ago. I had the privilege of knowing Frank Prophet, who was a banjo maker and dulcimer maker down in North Carolina and a fine singer of the old traditional songs. And someone brought a recording of Earl Scruggs picking the banjo in his inimitable style. The three-finger roll rather than the old rapping roll, you know, and asked him what he thought about that. And Frank said, I wish I knew how to do that and then not do it. Seems to me restraint is one of the things that mountain people do value a lot, and that's not putting down Earl's picking, but I think it showed something about. Frank, incidentally, said some wonderful things about tradition and his role. He felt that passing on the styles that he learned to play in, which he had learned from his father, and passing on his father's songs was the most important thing he could do. He wasn't very much interested in seeing if he could create a Frank Prophet sound, as it were. He just wanted to pass on these songs that he loved so much. And it seems to me that's been an important part of the traditional musicians. This is not to say they don't play lots of things and things they heard on the radio, things they've written and one thing or another. But so many of the fine old musicians like Alfred Bailey do have almost a religious sense, you know, of preserving something that they know is important to them, and they hope at least that it'll be important to those that come after them. This next one is Lamplighting Time in the Valley. Robert and Claudine Nobley are singing this. I don't know who wrote this. I'd be pleased to find out. I looked in everything I had and couldn't find it. It's a very familiar song. Martin and Roberts recorded it, and Ina and Ray Patterson much earlier.
There's a lamp shining bright in the cabin. Little window is shining for me, and I know that my mother is praying for the boys that she's longing to see. When it's like riding time in the valley, getting dreams I go back to my home. I can see that old lamp in the window. It will guide me wherever I go.
Wonderful song. Here's another bluegrass number by Cabin in Caroline, sung by Lester Flatt and written by Lester and Earl Scruggs. Of course, about as popular as those mother songs in the cabin is that girl that one might leave behind to go wandering. That goes all the way back. You remember Lord Lovell went out the country's far to sea. When he came back, he saw all these people gathered at the church. And he said, "What's a-happening here?" And they said, "Well, Lady Nancy has done passed on." And so, you know, he did the right thing there. They used to do that a lot. He just up and died on the spot, and they buried him there. And you had the old Barbary Allen theme of the rose and the briar twining up to the old church tower and tying a true lover's knot there. Wonderful songs, and these were extremely popular, of course, with people who were sentimental and who probably pined for that kind of love. Here's the last one in this series, Cabin on the Hill. It's Estill and Orna Ball with Lacey Richardson and Blair Reedy. This is a song written by B.L. Shook. When Alan Lomax came down and recorded this back in the 50s, he later put out a series on Atlantic label, about, I've forgotten how many, about 8 albums, I think, in the Sun Heritage series. And I was reading this and, of course, finding out who wrote these songs, and I saw the name S-C-H-A-A-U-K had written this song. And I thought, well, that's kind of an odd name. And I went elsewhere and looked and found out this man's name was S-H-O-O-K. Shook. But I could imagine that probably he might have said, Mr. Lomax probably said, "What's your name, boy?" And he said, "Shook." So he dutifully wrote it down. Another story along the line of that, two of my favorite musicians were Red Parham, P-A-H-A-M, and George Pegram. Red was from South Turkey Creek, North Carolina. He used to work for Bascom Lumford. And George Pegram was out at Asheboro. And if you know anything about North Carolina speech, you know that somewhere between Asheville and Morganton, the R disappears out of words, and so people sort of this side of Morganton, you say, where you live? Well, I say, I live in Morganton. But in Morganton and on out into the Piedmont, they'll probably say Morganton. See, the R is gone. So Mr. Pigram couldn't read and write, I think, and so he went down in Charlotte, I think it was, somewhere to get them some calling cards printed up. Well, he gave me one of these, and I looked at it, and it said, you know, George Pigram spelled right, and then here's Red Palm, P-H-A-L-M, and I said, that's not spelled right, and he said, yeah, those Jews don't know how to spell. That was his explanation, but I can imagine him going in and saying, the fellow said, now, what's his name was? Palm, you know, and well, you see a lot of that. There's a lot of humor in the way people pronounce words. I sent a student out to collect ballads one time. She went down to North Carolina, and lo and behold, she collected that ancient and beautiful old ballad called The Wife of Usher's Well, that you'll find in literary collections. But this was a North Carolina woman who gave her that and who knew the name of it, and so she came back and spelled it out, The Wife of Usher's Well, W-A-I-L. So, moving on. In spite of the love of early home place, there was also the yearning for that heavenly home. The religion of the mountains is strongly laced with Calvinism, or at least a version of Calvinism. Before labor-saving devices and good medicine, life indeed was something that people had to withstand, at least for a lot of people. And it was logical that this world here was a testing ground. If one could keep the faith here amid tribulations and in the face of powers and principalities, then one might reap a rich reward in heaven. People had only the barest of necessities, no surplus of money, no tenure, no status, and often no self-respect, thought of heaven as a place of light, no storm clouds, you know, the uncloudy day. With God, to be with God and Jesus and the family all together again, on streets of gold, listening to this wonderful music. The harps, I think, of heaven probably must have had a sort of bluegrass sound in the minds of people. It was also a place where we will meet loved ones, be a family again. There's a good story. Bill Monroe, you know, has become a legend. He's become kind of the sainted person of mountain music, I think. And someone tells the story of someone dying and going to heaven, and so Peter meets them and said, well, what would you like to see? Well, I'd like to see the bluegrass part of heaven. So he takes him over, and sure enough, over here is a lovely pasture, and there are campers over there, and 3 broken down buses, and people, you know, sitting around and picking, and he went along, and here's some fella sitting over here on the hood of a car singing White Dove, and he said, why, isn't that, yes, that's Brother Stanley. And he said, well, that's wonderful. And he goes on, and he hears somebody singing something out, and he said, who's that? Yes, he said, that's right. You know, you're listening to Lester Flatt there. Pretty soon he goes over and sees a man there in a 3-piece suit sitting on a stump with a big white hat, hair coming down out from under it, covering his ears, picking a mandolin. He said, oh, please don't tell me that Bill Monroe is dead. And he said, oh, no, that's God. He just thinks he's Bill Monroe. In describing heaven, it seemed to me that people have attributed to heaven all the things that they like here on earth. One fellow described that heaven as a Kentucky sort of place. When Billy Graham preached in Scotland a good many years ago, one writer said that when he gave the altar call, the aisles were filled with young women rushing down to the altar, very happy indeed at the prospect of spending eternity in heaven, North Carolina. That's where Billy's from. There are numerous songs about traveling through this world of sin. The best known is the spiritual poor, wayfaring stranger, or sometimes pilgrim, and it comes from about the time of the Second Great Awakening. This is Estill Ball singing this traditional song that I think is probably as well known as any I know. Bill Monroe, incidentally, sings this song just, I guess, as he heard it in the churches where he was growing up, without instrumentation, and it is one of the most beautiful things I've ever heard. I went to Carl Perkins's funeral, and one member of Congress, I've long since forgotten his name, sang, and they had other kinds of music, but the undertaker there in Heinemann sang Poor Wayfaring Stranger. I'm sorry, I left out one. I'm sorry, I got carried away a minute ago and forgot to play that one. That was part of my last sequence, I'm sorry about. Cabins Again, and that was Estill and Orna Ball and Lacey Richardson and Blair Reedy, written by B.L. Shook. I was so busy telling the story on Alan Lomax I forgot to play it. So now we hear Poor Wayfaring Stranger with Estill. Incidentally, that song is typical of songs of the Second Great Awakening. Songs about father. One verse about I'm going there to see my father. The next verse will be I'm going there to see my mother. I'm going there to see my children, or whatever. It was one way, easy way for people to remember the themes of a lot of these songs, so there was a lot of repetition. But that song could only have come out of, I think, what we think of as a strongly Calvinistic world, a world of trials and troubles that you have to get through in order to get over to the other side where everything will be better. This theme runs through a lot of these songs. Meeting loved ones up in heaven, a place where we will never grow old. One of George Pigram's most beautiful songs is Where We'll Never Grow Old, where we'll never be sick or bear the troubles we've had to in this earthly existence. This runs through all of the religious songs, and you will find verses in the secular songs as well, from the early folk to the modern country and gospel. And here's Doc Watson again singing Where Is Now My Father's Family, an old Baptist song.
Well,
Several of the speakers have talked about the importance of the departed ones, and anyone living in eastern Kentucky and seeing the meeting houses out in cemeteries, and if you know about the annual gatherings to decorate the graves to remember those who passed on in the past year or those who passed on 20 years ago, know the importance of this. And I believe it was Dr. McGee here this morning talking about moving 15,000 people out of the Norris Dam area without much problem at all, but when they started moving the graveyards, that's when they ran into trouble with the Tennessee Valley Authority. This whole remembrance of people who are gone is certainly reflected in the music as people talk about going to home where we'll be reunited with those that we love. I'm going to end this presentation with parts of 3 numbers by the Hee Haw Quartet that depict heaven as a place where there are no storm clouds. The world, again, is a pilgrimage, not our home, and heaven is the real home. I did this partially because a friend of mine loaned me a tape of the Hee Haw Quartet the other day. And it had, well, there were more than 3, I think, but these songs that I've got here, I think, illustrate the whole thing of heaven is home as well as anything. But also, I think the Hee Haw Quartet is one of the fine things on this program called Hee Haw. It's popular, you know, to laugh, you know, to put that program down because it sort of reinforces the stereotypes and so forth, and it is commercial, and perhaps that is true. But occasionally I find some good things on there. Some of the humor is good. And this quartet made up of Grandpa Jones, who's a favorite of mine, and Roy Clark and Ken Price and Buck Owens, I think has done some pretty good singing. So the 3 songs here are The Unclouded Day, This World Is Not My Home, I'm Just Passing Through, and another one just called Home. Go home. Well, there are many other songs I might have used. I keep thinking of them all the time, and I know you are thinking of several who would illustrate the same theme. But certainly the word home appears a great deal in both folk music and the country music of this region, and lots of other things associated with that. Cabins and mothers and daddies and, of course, heaven as a kind of recreated home where we'll all be together. Thank you very much. If there are any questions or if someone would like to add to this, I'll be glad to hear from you. Getting down to the end of our time.